Hey, guys.
Okay, we're now broadcasting. I think we only had about 30 registrants for this, so we'll see. Good evening. If you're just joining us, we'll be a few minutes before we get started. And actually, one of the things I'd like to do before we get started is do a little poll so that we would have a better idea of what our clients like as far as timing for our webinars. So I'm going to launch that poll. And if you have a suggestion as to what times might be best for you, please indicate that. Okay. And Tom, you had a question? I think I've unmuted you.
No, I don't have a question.
Oh, it says you raised your hand, so.
Oh, I was playing with the buttons, sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, we do have a Q&A button in case anybody would like to ask a question during the presentation. And we will open it for questions at the end. You can also enter something in the chat box if you like. Again, those are found at the bottom of your screen. Now, it says Tom Gerst raised his hand. Did you have something you wanted to say? I unmuted you, I think.
He's muted.
Okay, I can't seem to unmute it for some reason. No, he is unmuted according to mine. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so did you want to say something, Tom Gerst?
No, I didn't. I say I was just moving my fingers around here.
Oh, okay.
You must have thought I was raising my hand.
Well, yeah, it said that you did, so
Yeah, okay, all right.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Anita Kayat. I am a member of SCORE, both in the Cleveland office and the Akron office. And I do a lot of mentoring with nonprofits. This series on nonprofits starts out with how to launch a nonprofit in Ohio. The second session, which will be next week, is funding your nonprofit. And we cover just about every possibility for funding. The third session is grant writing basics in case you decide you need to write grants. And the last session is capacity building for your nonprofit. So there are those 4 sessions, and we hope that you'll be interested in attending all of them. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about SCORE. I know many of you are SCORE clients, or involved in SCORE, but so I'll make it brief, and then we'll start our session. So SCORE is an organization that again, is a nonprofit. It was formed in 1964, so we've been in business for well over 50 years. And we've helped more than 12 million people achieve their business goals. So our mission is to foster vibrant small business communities through mentoring and education. And we hope that by doing that, every person who wants to be a business owner will have the support necessary to accomplish that. And one of our core values is that our client's success is our success. And that's very true. We can't be successful if our clients aren't successful. So we help small businesses, as we say, through mentoring and also doing low cost or free business training, such as the webinars that we're doing right now. In the past and hopefully in the future, we will be doing more in-person webinars, but currently everything we're doing is online. And then very importantly, we share business templates and resources on our website. And there are just a myriad of resources and tools available, from templates for business plans, financial plans, marketing plans. There are recorded webinars on just about any topic that you might be interested in. There's a startup roadmap that leads you through the whole process in small increments that make it work for you. So please go to our website and take a look at what we have to offer. So last year, we were able to create almost 30,000 new businesses and over 97,000 new jobs, and help about 58,000 clients increase the revenue for their businesses. So now I'm going to turn this over to Greg Friedman, who is also a SCORE mentor in the Cleveland office. He's a CPA and has many years' experience working with nonprofits. So I will turn it over to him. And Greg, it's yours.
Hey, good evening, everyone. It appears that December really came in like a lion for us. But a little bit of background about myself. I'm a CPA. I started off originally auditing not-for-profits and then branched off into being on board of directors of several different forms of not-for-profits. And some of these not-for-profits I've had over a 40-year relationship with. So Ohio is a pretty prolific not-for-profit state. There's over 42,000 501c3 entities, and a 501c3 entity are the entities that have filed for and most likely have received their letter from the IRS indicating that that donations to that entity will be not taxable to the charitable donor. And the not-for-profits in Ohio generate billions of dollars of revenue. Some of the not-for-profits are really, really quite large. Some of the larger hospitals and colleges and universities are not-for-profits. From that, you can see that they do employ hundreds of thousands of people, and they can add jobs during the economic downturn, which is pretty obvious with COVID that a lot of medical facilities are adding jobs and other related facilities are adding jobs too. Ohioans are quite generous and give several $1 billion to charities each year. And this is particularly true in Northeast Ohio. So serving the mission remains a financial challenge and really a major goal that the not-for-profit has to strive for. The challenges around not-for-profits is there's a lot of competition out there. There's only a finite pool of funding. There's competition from existing not-for-profits. So if you're thinking about starting a not-for-profit, one of the things you probably need to do is do some research in the geographical area that you plan to serve to kind of scope out what type of competition might be out there. It may be difficult to penetrate the market to obtain funding. And there can be difficulty in recruiting, but also retaining qualified and dedicated board members and employees. People who are good fundraisers for not-for-profits are very, very valuable commodities, and they tend to be quite liquid and may move from organization to organization. And there are also opportunities for not-for-profits, to cooperate and collaborate. And part of that is food banks can be aligned with, say, housing authorities and things like that. So there's opportunities for both governmental and not-for-profit organizations to collaborate with each other. So SCORE members can provide differences about the pros and cons of each of the options. And there's an S Corp, a limited liability corporation, partnership, and single member nonprofits. Well, one of the key things to remember is if you're looking to get 501c3 status from the Internal Revenue Service, you almost have to start as an Ohio not-for-profit corporation and not a limited liability company. So these are the types of options that SCORE members can help you go through to determine the type of not-for-profit you want to be. But if you want to be a 501c3 where donations to you would be tax deductible to the donor, then you have to have a pretty specific focus and a pretty specific charter when you incorporate with the state of Ohio, and then apply to the IRS for 501c3 status. Here we get into some more of the details. Incorporated nonprofits, so if you're in Ohio nonprofit corporations, we talked about donors being able to deduct their contributions depending on their individual tax status. There's personal liability protection under most areas. Again, corporate personal liability protection does not cover the members of the not-for-profit corporation for failure to pay all withholding taxes and for gross misconduct by directors or officers of that corporation. But again, the 501c3 denotes sort of like a seal of approval where you are tax exempt. So it might be something you want to obtain. The cons are that you're required to have a board of directors consisting of at least 3 directors. And that's generally the executive director, the secretary, and the treasurer. And the IX tax exemption application is complex, but there are 2 forms. There's a 1023-EZ and a 1023. The 1023-EZ is for not-for-profits that expect to have annual revenues of less than $50,000 a year for the first 3 years. And with the IRS, there are annual reporting requirements under a Form 990. Now, this IRS Form 990, if you're really small, it's more or less like a postcard. If you have some level of revenues, you might be able to file a 990 990 EZ. And then once you start to really develop your not-for-profit, you may have to file a full 990, which can be 26 to, and I have actually some organizations where from 26 to 90 pages. So unincorporated not-for-profit, it's easier to form. You can register the name of the state, develop bylaws, sort of like a constitution by how you'll operate. There are no state filings required. It's an informal business. Donors cannot deduct contributions made to an unincorporated nonprofit. And since it's not incorporated, there's no liability protection related to the operation of that not-for-profit business. So depending on the scope of the not-for-profit business, there could be some significant areas where liability could arise, say develop for providing personal services. So in that case, you would probably want to consider incorporating.
Greg, this is Bob Fedor. Could you comment on typical unincorporated nonprofits and how many are out there?
They tend to be smaller in scope, and they have very, very focused, usually very focused and narrow missions. An example of one is there's a group of people that make homemade teddy bears that they distribute to people in housing authorities. So as long as you don't leave a pin in the teddy bear, there's probably pretty low liability. But that's, the kind of like an informal business that they're out there, and they're quite a few of them. I can't give you a number how many are operating in the state of Ohio, though. I'm not sure. So the 501c3 designation, when you actually go out to the IRS website, and that's a good place to go. If you go out to the IRS and Google charitable organizations, they have a very nice website out there, and you can look at all sorts of things, including like life cycle of a not-for-profit and things like that. It's all drop-down menus, easy to use, so that's something you would probably want to look at. But there are over 30 different types of 501c3s under the Internal Revenue Code, and they include religious, charitable, education, and other nonprofit initiatives. And so what are some unusual, or would seem to be unusual, not-for-profit organizations? Well, one's the National Rifle Association. Another one's the NFL. So it's a very, very broad spectrum. It includes social clubs like Elks clubs and other clubs like that. And there's two basic categories. There are nonprofits, private foundations, and most of them receive funds from one or more number of small donors. And they're usually created to grant awards to not-for-profits or public charities in alignment with the donor's funds intent in giving that money to the private foundations to administer. And then your public charities are supported by many funders, donors, agencies, or members of the general public. And community foundations are generally classified as public charities. But most of the, I would say, vast majority of 501c3 startups that SCORE works with deal with public charities, private foundations, or something that a public charity as it grows may evolve into. And if they don't evolve into a private foundation, they're probably going to private foundations to see if they can be awarded a grant. And that'll be another subject of a webinar. I think that's the third one. So a tax-exempt nonprofit organization is formed to serve a purpose, and it's a charitable purpose. And once it files with and qualifies with Internal Revenue Service, it can get a 501c3 exemption from the Internal Revenue Service. And that will allow the not-for-profit to accept donations and indicate to the donor that those donations are tax deductible for income tax purposes if it meets the donor's tax status, which can vary significantly from donor to donor. One of the key things about the board of directors is the board of directors are responsible under corporate law and under the 501c3 statutes to make sure that the not-for-profit maintains its mission. So they oversee the daily operations of the not-for-profit and oversee the officer who is the head of the not-for-profit's daily operations. And that can be, an executive director. And they set the salary and they can hire and fire the executive director. So when you're establishing a not-for-profit, you cannot really serve both on the board and be the executive director running the day-to-day operations. It's possible, but it really makes things very blurry. And if an executive director can attend board meetings, but they would be a non-voting member. Not-for-profits, it's kind of a misnomer. You want to generate a surplus. You want to make more money than you pay out so that you have some money that can be applied to future operations, in case you should have some financial difficulties. And many not-for-profits right now are suffering some financial difficulties under COVID-19. And if you don't have a build up of a surplus in these types of circumstances, they can be very challenging to the not-for-profit. Another thing about a not-for-profit is that unlike a for-profit corporation, that when it terminates, any surplus can be distributed to the shareholders of the corporation. In a not-for-profit corporation, on termination, any surplus must be donated to a not-for-profit with a similar mission to the not-for-profit that is terminating. So typically you have the board of directors, and we talked about there's a minimum of 3 directors. There'll be a president of the board, a secretary, responsible for keeping corporate records, and treasurer responsible for keeping financial records. And the executive director or president of the not-for-profit reports directly to the board of directors, and the salary of the executive director of the not-for-profit is established by the board of directors on an independent basis. And the directors ascertain, at least on a yearly basis, whether or not the executive director or president of the not-for-profit is satisfactorily maintaining or accomplishing the mission of the not-for-profit. Executive director or president then hires staff, fundraisers, recruits volunteers, and the executive director or president has the power to establish the salaries and to hire and fire members of the staff and volunteer fundraisers. So why do we need a board? Because really, to maintain 501c3 status, you have to have that. So the IRS, it's an IRS requirement for 501c3 status. The board can also help the not-for-profit manage priorities, policies, and changes. They're there to evaluate the performance of the executive director of the not-for-profit. And part of that evaluation, performance evaluation, is making sure that the not-for-profit is adhering to its mission. And this is a part of the due diligence process of the members of the board of directors. They are required to assure that the not-for-profit is adhering to its mission. If it deviates too far from its mission, there could be legal consequences directed at the board of directors. So the governing principles, you have a mission, the board creates the mission statement and defines the purposes and values by which that mission statement will be adhered to. And you may recognize this as being somewhat similar to some of the information that I need to provide in the introduction about SCORE, because we are a not-for-profit. Resources, there's a key challenge is financing and developing human resources. Initial growth of not-for-profits can be difficult, and many times the professional qualifications of the board of directors may be called upon to help with accounting issues or human resources issues to support the not-for-profit. There's also oversight, and here we are, we talked about this a little bit previously, which are the legal, ethical, and fiduciary responsibilities of the board and their relationship with the executive director and evaluating the performance and effectiveness of that executive director. Outreach. This is critical. Board members serve as ambassadors to the community. The board members should be entirely familiar with the mission and the values and the purpose of the not-for-profit. And they go out and every opportunity they have, they communicate the mission of the not-for-profit to people in hopes of that they interrelate with, in hopes of helping to assist the raising of funds for the not-for-profit. But once again, the board has a legal, fiduciary, and moral obligation and is always accountable to the public trust. So you need to make sure that the board of directors need to be aware of those responsibilities, and they generally are. So now we talked about this a little bit, that, you know, when you're looking for board member selection, you want to identify skills, experience related to the mission and how you want the board of directors to represent you. And as I mentioned before, you seek board members to fill in gaps and skill deficiencies of the non-for-profit, such as accountants, attorneys, and also human resource assets. So if a not-for-profit on its board can have an attorney, an accountant, maybe some HR people, maybe some people with a marketing background, you know, that will greatly assist the possibilities of the not-for-profit being successful. So how do you find board members? So here's some search tips and more. Stay in touch with these people frequently. Make sure that they make them feel needed. If you're serving on a board, you want to make sure, most board members want to be active. And in the vast majority of not-for-profits, board members are not paid. Sometimes you get into really large not-for-profits or medical not-for-profits, their board members are paid, but for most of the, if not all the not-for-profits that SCORE helps to serve, the board members are not paid. Most board members are looked upon to make a donation or contribution to the not-for-profit, but the board and the not-for-profit should be clear about what those expectations are. And there's, you know, defining the equipment, the time, the focus, the access, and how much you might be expecting the people to contribute, the board members to contribute. And then it's important to provide onboard orientation for new board members so that they're familiar with their fiduciary responsibilities and the expectations of time, focus, access, and monetary contributions. The effectiveness of board members should be evaluated on at least an annual basis. And a lot of times this is accomplished through a board member self-evaluation questionnaire. Some of the areas where you evaluate board members is, you know, how many meetings did they participate in? How many did they miss? Do they serve on any committees of the board, like maybe a finance committee or an investment committee or a fundraising committee? So those are the types of things where, again, a lot of this is these smaller not-for-profits rely on a board member filling out a survey, which is in effect, you know, them reviewing their own performance annually and seeing how they're performing. So how do you recruit board members? And you have to have a very specific mission and then have an elevator speech. An elevator speech is something, you know, that you can communicate in, you know, an elevator ride that will communicate and interest the potential board member in wanting to learn more about the not-for-profit. You need to show them and engage them in your mission and thoroughly explain the role and expectations. And if they don't want to participate, you can ask them if they can suggest someone else to participate. But there's some good places to look for potential board members, particularly if you're involved in social, fraternal, or religious organizations. By talking to those people that you have contact with already, you know, generally within a church or a fraternal or social organization, you may be able to find the attorney or the accountant or the HR person or marketing person that you may want to be a board member on your not-for-profit. So those are places where you can start to look for board members. So there's styles and stages of boards. Founding board, typically there may be few or no staff, and board members are active in daily operations. So you may just have your basic 3 board members, but then as you grow, you may expand your board members. I'm on a board of a very large 75-year-old not-for-profit that has 50 board members all over the community. So that is not typical, obviously, but once you become established, you may find it easier to attract more qualified board members. Now with governing, you may begin to see that you can't operate just with people on a volunteer basis, so that you need to hire full-time staff. And again, we've talked about the board will handle the policies, direction, oversight, and mission fulfillment. And again, the board hires the executive director and sets the salary for the executive director. Executive director, we've talked about, hires a staff, manages daily operations, and also volunteers that are within the not-for-profit organization. One of the things that are big challenges to not-for-profit, and defining and measuring success. And that is articulated in Form 990, generally in the full form, not necessarily in the 990 EZ. But one of the things that's kind of unique to not-for-profits is a statement of functional expenses. And those talk about how the money you raise is spent on program services and how much money is spent directly toward those program expenses and how much is overhead. And once a not-for-profit becomes fully established, the general rule of thumb used by the charity rating agencies like Charity Navigator and GuideStar is they want to see that 80% of the money you raise goes to providing mission-based services and 20% is overhead. Now that's very difficult for a startup to obtain, but that's ultimately going to be the goal. And that comes down to that bullet point where financial success is not the primary goal of a not-for-profit, but meeting the mission is one of the primary financial success stories of a not-for-profit. So you have to have tangible outcomes, just not the number of people served. Then you have to be able to attract and motivate people to serve in the work for the not-for-profit and be on the board. And generally, those are people who are motivated by the mission. Other people are more hands-on, like they're motivated by involvement. And some people are seeking non-financial rewards. And a lot of time, those are people who are volunteers who do staff work, which would normally be paid for by a for-profit corporation. So again, you're required to file an annual form on 990. And again, there's a postcard form for really small entities. There's a 990 EZ for intermediate sized entities. And there's a full 990 for the larger, more developed not-for-profits. And the way you find out about which form you file is by reviewing the IRS instructions relative to Form 990. You also have to be careful with respect to having a conflict of interest policy and a board remuneration policy. The conflict of interest might be that if someone on your board owns a construction company, it would be potential conflict of interest to hire that construction company to build office space out or do leasehold improvements for a not-for-profit. And the board remuneration policy may be as simple as that there is no remuneration to the board members, which is the case in all but some of the very large not-for-profits in the state of Ohio or across the United States. There's no annual audit requirement in the state of Ohio. However, as a not-for-profit grows, the board may require the not-for-profit to have an audit in order to protect and make sure that they're being protected by having that audit prepared. So again, there's strict deadlines for filing, just like personal tax returns. There are other types of documents you have to file on a ongoing basis, say with the state. One of them is about every 3 to 5 years, you might get a notification from the state. Just, it's continuing existence statement. Are you still in business? If you don't respond to that request from the state, you could potentially lose the corporate name with the state filing, and then the state might put you out there as not operating any longer. So you have to pay careful attention to not only tax returns, but information returns and registration statements. There's a reasonable compensation documentation so that you're not overpaying your executive director or any of your key staff members too much money. And generally, as a not-for-profit grows, what they will do is they will compare the salary of their executive director and their key compensated employees to the compensation received by other employees that are in similar size not-for-profits. So that's one way to do a reasonable compensation test. It has become a tax issue with IRS for some of the larger not-for-profits, and whether the compensation are being paid to certain executives in not-for-profits, large not-for-profits, are reasonable or not, which is why you will eventually end up doing a reasonable compensation documentation test. The board not only has the right, but they have an obligation to ask about the nonprofit's operations and management and adherence to the not-for-profit's mission. There are basically two revenue sources for not-for-profits: earned and contributed income. So how can you earn income? You might do it through consulting fees, fee for service, or product sales. So you can have earned revenue through those types of sources. So you may provide consulting firms services to people that need counseling and collect a fee for that. The other arm of the revenue sources is contributed services, which primarily in smaller not-for-profits are going to be coming from individuals. They could be coming from corporations also, and foundations, from foundations generally in the form of grants. So you might be looking to a local foundation or a national foundation and writing grant applications, and we'll talk about that further in another part of the webinar series. There's also governmental contributions, and many arms of the federal government and state governments offer governmental sources of funding, but they're generally very narrow and very restricted in terms of how you can spend those monies. So one of the key challenges to a not-for-profit is obtaining money or contributions that can be used to pay operating salaries that aren't directly associated with the mission. So when you're looking at grants, governmental grants from foundations or money from corporations, you want to be careful to see what the restrictions are on that money as to how it can be spent, because you may find your hands tied to pay day-to-day salaries or processes that do not directly impact what the request from the foundation or the corporation comes from. Bequests can be difficult to work with because, so let's say someone says, well, when I die, you can have $50,000 from my estate. Well, you don't really know where you're going to get that money. So it's sort of like you're waiting for the person to pass on, and you might be able to look at actuarial chart or something like that to try to make a determination when that might occur. But it's really income that you don't control the timing over its receipt. The other thing with government organizations is once you get above, from the US government, once you get above a certain amount of money from a federal government grant authority, then you may be required to have an audit, which can be expensive. So we were just talking about that relative to the last slide on revenues, balancing both restricted and unrestricted fund sources. So restricted funds might be, you can only spend them on mission-related activities, and maybe you can't pay your light bills, or maybe your rent can't be included in that, or you can't buy office supplies or fixed assets relative to that. So you have to watch the restrictions very carefully and then try to find unrestricted sources of funding. And this has been a particular challenge, particularly in the COVID-19 era, where it's hard to deliver, not-for-profits to deliver services and meet their mission funding. So a lot of not-for-profits have been going back to restricted donors and asking them to unrestrict those funding sources. And many institutions, and I know of several in Northeast Ohio, have been successful in getting restrictions removed from funding sources. Foundations have long timelines and very specific timelines for grants. So if you're looking to obtain a grant, you have to start early in the process. In many cases, you might have to have operated for 2 or 3 years before you can even qualify to file for a grant. And the grant timelines are like drop dead timelines. You can't say, oh, I need another 5 days to do this. They're that competitive that you have to make sure that you meet all the timelines and you answer all the questions in a focused manner relative to the foundation's grant writing process. So again, we talked about the statement of functional expenses, and that comes out where funders and donors are looking at how effective and efficient and accountable an organization is, and how you can measure outcomes and not just head counts. Well, we serve, 500 people, and let's say your mission is to teach inner city children to improve their reading skills. Well, they don't want they want to know, well, we help these people improve from a 3rd grade reading level to a 5th grade reading level. So that's kind of like a measurable outcome that fundraisers and donors might be looking at. So again, it's a very competitive business. Not-for-profits are very competitive, and the donors and funders are becoming more sophisticated in how they evaluate whether or not to fund a not-for-profit based upon measurable outcome and by reviewing things like the functional expense statement. So funding for program support is what you would call restricted funding. And those are the usual types of funding. And again, funding for capital expenditures, buying a photocopier or equipment, may come from an endowment or specific fundraising campaigns. Some not-for-profits approach corporations saying, hey, are you going to be retiring any of your photocopiers, which may not be state of the art, but may be perfectly suited to the not-for-profit's uses. And lots of times corporations will donate equipment that they no longer need to not-for-profits. They get a tax deduction and you get a very serviceable asset. So it's something to keep in mind. And again, the funding for administration and overhead, unrestricted funds are very difficult to raise. So common sources of funding for not-for-profits, program service revenue, maybe up to 7 is a percentage on average. Not-for-profits uses 73%. Contributions, gifts, and government grants are generally like about 21%. And special events, dues, rental income, and net sales for goods are average out at 6%. But there are many not-for-profits that may make very significant amounts of money from dues or special event income or rental income. And an example of that would be, the Cleveland Zoological Society, which makes a very large amount of the revenue from membership dues and special event income. Although obviously now special event income due to COVID is very significantly suppressed. So these are average numbers, and depending on the mission of your not-for-profit, your funding sources may vary significantly from these average numbers. So when you're looking to complete a funding proposal, the information generally that is required are organizational goals and objectives, the mission, the population, and geographical area that you serve. Who comprises your board and staff and what are their qualifications. Programs and services, your track record, your program operational efficiency. Again, that boils down back to your statement of functional expenses. Finances, what does your balance financial statements and your projections look like? How accurate are your projections? Your funding request, looking for either program support, capital project support, or operating funds. And again, it's going to vary upon, who you're going to the funding request for as to which of these funding request items are going to be the focal point. Generally, it's going to be for program expenses. As we mentioned before, getting capital project and operating funds can be difficult to get, but if you can find a proposal where you can apply for capital project funds or operating funds, then that's something you should look into. And again, you have to look at the time frame, make sure you adhere to all the time frame measurements and reporting guidelines for the funding request. And then also make sure that if you accept the funding monies, that you can measure the outcome of the use of those funds to meet the standards that are going to be within the operating fund proposal details. So you have to be able to make sure that you can spend the money in the way that the organization that's donating the funds wants you to, and that you can measure the outcome that they desire in order to say that you successfully funded, use those funds as detailed in the funding request forms. So how to get started? You want to develop a mission statement and document it. Drop articles of incorporation, which talk about how the corporation will be structured. You select a name and you register the name and incorporate as a nonprofit organization in the state of Ohio. When you go to do the name selection, you'll be asked to enter the name that you want to use, and you may find that's already in use. If it is, you can't use it. So you'll have to file, maybe consider the use of another name. When I organized my LLC consulting firm in Ohio, I went through 8 names before I got the one that finally stuck. You're going to not, it says select board members. You're going to need to recruit board members. You're going to have at least 3. Next, you prepare bylaws. And bylaws basically talk about how the company's going to be operating, what your fiscal year is, how many directors are you going to have, how long are the directors going to serve, things like that. Now, for articles of incorporations and bylaws, there are some basic forms available that you can modify to meet the missions. You can modify those draft bylaws and articles to adhere to the mission and how you want to operate the not-for-profit. And then you're going to need to prepare a business plan and a budget. Generally a 12-month cash flow statement and 2 to 3 projections of fundraising needs. And then once you're done with filing with the state and you have articles and bylaws in place and your board in place, you can then determine whether or not you're going to file a 10 Form 23 or 1020 EZ to get your tax exemption status and what is basically your tax exemption letter from the federal government. And these items are pretty well laid out by looking at the asterisk at the bottom of the slide. The Ohio Attorney General's office has an excellent handbook for not-for-profits that can help walk you through these steps in a very methodical basis. So you need to, for filing with the Secretary of State, of course, you have to have your name, you have to submit your articles of incorporation, which is a Form 532B, lists the officers and directors, and a copy of your IRS exemption letter when it's approved and issued. That will occur later on in the process. But once you have that exemption letter and you can file with the state of Ohio, then you can obtain sales tax exemption certificate from the state of Ohio. So if you buy supplies or other equipment that might normally be taxed by the state of Ohio, you can avoid paying sales tax on that. You have to appoint a statutory agent. The statutory agent is the person that the state will send all communications to. So if you, and that's where like the letter of the continuing existence goes to. So that's what you would, statutory agent will get all communications from the state of Ohio. And then you have a filing fees totaling $99. And again, you mentioned you file an annual registration fee. It's an online system and pay the annual fee that's calculated by the system. They're generally quite low. And then we talked about the statement of continuing existence is filed every 5 years. If you don't, you can lose your corporate name. Hey, Bob, could you take this slide, please? Or Anita?
Okay. Again, you have to file with the Ohio Department of Taxation and complete a tax exemption certificate with each of your vendors that you want to get tax abatement from. And then you would submit your copy of the IRS letter for verification of your federal tax exemption to the Ohio Department of Taxation in order to get your tax abatement through the Ohio Department as well. So, did you want me to continue, Greg?
I think you had to step out, Anita.
Okay.
I can take it back. I just had
Okay.
a little bit of indigestion.
Okay.
So you need to prepare a business plan. And these are the key elements of a business plan, which would be executive summary, compensation analysis, marketing analysis, organization and management, service and product line overviews, and then appendices, including critical corporate documentations, a SWOT analysis, that's your strength, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats analysis, and how you will be competitive under through the evaluation of SWOT analysis, and then resumes of key officers and perhaps even board members. Now, as Anita mentioned early in the introduction, that there are templates available from SCORE, score.org, relative to assisting you with establishing the business plan. Now, SCORE mentors cannot write your business plan for you, but they can review and critique your business plan drafts to get it into a very specific and finite document that will serve the needs of your business. So plan and plan some more. The business plan is a living document. As you grow in business, opportunities change, improve, something like COVID virus, occurs, then you need to update your business plan, and you need to continue to learn, know trends, do your research, and then begin to build a network using social media and a well-developed website. Today was kind of like a unique day because it was Giving Tuesday. And I must have received at least 12 to 15 requests for donations from various not-for-profits in their observance of Giving Tuesday. And, these ones that began, they were soliciting, all had very well-developed websites. And you could tell that these people had social media skills to identify potential donors. So we had mentioned that the IRS.gov website is valuable. The IRS Pub 557 for tax exempt status is very helpful. Form 1023 and 1023 EZ instructions are available, and by reading the instructions you can tell which form you should file. Again, the Ohio Guide for Starting a Not-for-Profit from the Corporate Secretary's Office. Charity Navigator can help you gain information about your competitors. They tend to be easier and less expensive to use, in my experience, than GuideStar. But GuideStar is also a valuable resource. You can also, with GuideStar and Candide, or the Candide organization, can be very helpful. There are Candide people in Cleveland, Ohio, that can help you identify foundations that may be interested or aligned with your mission. And you have to make an appointment with Candide to do that. But also from Candide, there's a very valuable tool out there, which is no cost, and it's called the Nonprofit Startup Assessment Tool. And that's available for free. And it's sort of like a questionnaire that you fill out the parts of it. It kind of tells you how prepared you are in different areas of not-for-profit establishment. It tells you where you stand and where you might need to focus more attention or make more improvement before you start the not-for-profit. But that's available at grantspace.org/nonprofit-startup. And we can share that with you. The Chronicle of Philanthropy, it's a monthly newspaper, but you can get a free email letter. It keeps you up to date with what's happening within the not-for-profit sector. It'll talk about government and federal grants and foundation grants. There's the Philanthropy News Digest, which is from the Foundation Center. It's available free of charge. And there's also a Rich Fan group that has information that you can receive in a free newsletter. So free is always good for a not-for-profit. Some more not-for-profit assets are listed, including Blue Avocado, the National Council of Websites, which is very searchable, and you may be able to gather information that specifically focuses on your mission, your not-for-profit's mission. And then you can also find top foundations in Ohio by looking at the website that's quoted there, and they're a good foundation locator. You can also, as I mentioned before, make an appointment with Candide in Cleveland, and they can help you do these types of searches also. And then Philanthropy Ohio is a good research site for Ohio philanthropic organizations. And since I would assume that most of not-for-profits that are going to be established by SCORE clients in Cleveland are going to be focused on resources of philanthropy mainly from Ohio, or maybe nationally, depending on what the mission of the not-for-profit is. So we talked about the 1023, and the 1023 is the form. Once you get done setting up all your documentation with the state of Ohio, you file the form 1023 that's applicable. You can see the 1023 itself. The full form is 28 pages, and it's filled out on paper, and must include certain key data, which is detailed in the instructions for the form. If you qualify, a much easier route is to file the form 1023 easy. It's only 3 pages, and it can be filed online. And for the SCORE clients, we're not dealing with generally dealing. You're going to be a non-foreign entity, basically, if you're a SCORE client. Your gross receipts have to be estimated to be less than $50,000, and your assets are going to be less than $250,000. So For many startups, they would qualify for the 1023 EZ. But that's something that you can discuss with the SCORE mentor based upon once you've reviewed the Form 1023 EZ instructions. So for filing Form 1023s, these are the list of the requirements that you need to adhere to. And they're detailed in the instructions. We're not going to go over them completely here. If you require expedition to expedite the processing of the form, it's an extra fee. You need to have your EIN number, which you would get from the state of Ohio when you file with them. So most of a lot of this information will be readily available. Schedules A through H are only required for the full Form 1023, and you have to attach a form of payment for the 1023 fee, which is $600, and the EZ fee, which is $275. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. And I think I see that there's one in the box already.
This Bob Peter, let me take this one from David. Do requests include restriction qualifiers? It actually goes the opposite. Whoever you're requesting the money from will tell you what the restrictions are, and then you have to incorporate that restriction into the request. For example, we at SCORE have 7 counties from Sandusky to Ashtabula, and some of the people we request funds for say, well, it has to be spent in, for example, Ashtabula County or Lorain County. And then so our request will have to be specific to what is going to be done in those counties.
That's right, Bob.
Does that answer the question? Right.
That's right, Bob. You also have to be review the restriction and make sure you can fulfill it.
Correct. But, you know, as a person myself who, my job at SCORE is to go out and get funding, I don't want to hear about restrictions. I assume there's no restrictions unless they tell me. But I will inquire.
Okay, one thing I would like to ask you is to fill out the evaluation poll before we finish. I'm going to launch that and would appreciate it if you would fill it out. As we mentioned, there are 3 other webinars in this series that kind of build on this particular one as the foundation. The next one is going to be on funding, which is a very important aspect if you're a nonprofit. Everybody's always scrambling for funding. And the third one, again, is on writing grants. So those, I think, would be very helpful to most of you if you're interested in nonprofits. One of the questions I frequently get from my nonprofit clients or from my clients is, I can't decide whether to be a nonprofit or a for-profit. And the answer is kind of simple in a way, because if you're going into business in order to make money, if that's your primary focus, you should be a for-profit business. But if you're considering your mission is to help somebody, to help a particular population to improve or to teach, to educate, whatever, but your motivation is really to help other people, then you're probably more suitable for a nonprofit. So, they can be pretty clear cut as to whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit. So if there are no further questions, I'd like to again thank you for joining us tonight, and thank Greg for doing a presentation. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week at the same time in the same place. And have a pleasant evening.